SABC News presentation.
Good evening and welcome to Interface. My name is Rams Mabote. Tonight we explore whether the public is losing confidence in the National Prosecuting Authority, or is it a misunderstanding of how it works? You may join this discussion, comment on our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3, or send a text message to 33726. But first, let's take a look at this insight by Lindo Zikri.
The National Prosecuting Authority strives to ensure public confidence in South Africa's criminal justice system. Reports about the state and the inner workings at the NPA have shaken that confidence, where most recently the head of the NPA, Menzi Simelane's appointment, was rendered invalid by the Constitutional Court. On the back of the Constitutional Court ruling comes a question on whether the NPA will ever shed the perception that some of its decisions are politically motivated. Withdrawal of charges against ANC provincial leaders Peggy and Mike Mabuyakulu caused dismay amongst opposition groups. The NPA dropped fraud charges against suspended crime intelligence boss Richard Mdluli. Hawk sources said the provisional withdrawal of charges suggested that powerful people were being protected. Some high-profile cases where the NPA successfully managed to convict include State Security Minister Siyabonga Cwele's wife, Cheryl Cwele. She is currently serving a 20-year sentence. Businessman and former financial advisor to the President Jacob Zuma, Shabir Sheikh, former South African National Police Commissioner Jackie Selebi. Is the Republic's prosecutorial body doing enough to retain public confidence? And are they working hard enough to protect all South African citizens?
That insight was compiled by Lindo Zikri. Tonight, we are discussing the National Prosecuting Authority, better known as the NPA. My guests are City Press Assistant Editor Adrian Basson and Executive Secretary at the Council for the Advancement for the Constitution of South Africa, Lawson Naidu. We had invited the National Prosecuting Authority, the Department of Justice, and the Presidency of South Africa, but they all have declined. Adrian, I read articles that you write and articles that are written by the media, how the NPA has lost its case, Breitenbach hearing pits NPA against NPA, boss gets put over Amigo's case. I tend to get the view that the media has framed the NPA in a particular way that says to me it is a losing organization.
Rams, I'm not sure if it's the media portraying the NPA in that way or if it's the NPA messing up themselves and the media reflecting what's actually going on at the NPA. I think all those cases you mentioned over the past few months, and even since the appointment of Menzi Simelane and this large cloud that's been hanging over his appointment, the public and even NPA prosecutors himself have been having doubts about the integrity and the fearlessness of this organization to prosecute without fear or favor.
By the way, send us your SMSs on 33726 or get into our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3. However, I'm reading the annual report of the NPA, and it says things that I don't see in the media. Things like the NPA has maintained a high conviction rate in all courts. That's district, regional, and high court, with an overall conviction rate of 88.8%. It speaks about how there's positive clearance of backlogs in the courts. There's a reduction of 12.2% of number of cases withdrawn. So I get worried about what we read mostly is about these failures.
Well, obviously the media can always do better in its reporting of all state institutions. But I would say that I think the conviction rate only reflects cases that eventually makes it to court. There's also a lot of other cases that don't even make it to court. And that's where the whole criminal justice system must be looked at. But the things that we spoke about earlier is high-profile matters. It's not small, willy-nilly cases in lower courts. It's the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions that the Constitutional Court last week said was irrational. The President took an irrational decision when he appointed Advocate Simelane. It is the disciplinary charges against a very senior anti-corruption prosecutor for allegedly spurious reasons. It is a withdrawal of corruption charges against powerful ANC politicians, and there's not enough information coming from the NPA to dispute those fears around selective prosecution.
I'd like us to deal with those cases as you mentioned, but let me, Lawson, invite you in here and say, we can't blame the National Prosecuting Authority for failure, if one can put it that way, of its heads, the NDPPs. They don't appoint themselves.
And indeed they don't. And the very onerous responsibility rests on the President, who, in terms of the current legislative and constitutional framework, is the person that appoints the NDPP. And as the Constitutional Court has recently reaffirmed, that person must be a fit and proper person, not just with regard to their experience, conscientiousness and integrity, but very importantly, in order to be able to fulfill the functions of the office of the NPA. And that means to prosecute criminal actions on behalf of the state without fear, favour or prejudice. And that means that that office must function operationally as an independent institution at an operational level. And so the person that's entrusted with that job plays a very critical role in the whole of our criminal justice system. Without
fear, favour or prejudice, the view here is that the Menzi Simelane specifically, and probably the other NDPPs before him, would have failed in that part. But that's a perception more than a reality, is it? I mean, how do we know that they had favour, fear or prejudice towards one or the other person?
Well, I think, you know, judging from the cases, the examples that you've just listed, the Mgluli case, the Amigos case in KwaZulu-Natal, and so on, where we've seen selective prosecutions and prosecutions that have been where a lot of work has been done by prosecutors, and then decisions are taken higher up in the NPA to drop particular cases, so, and that has an impact on the morale within the organisation as well.
I would assume, though, and I'll come back to you, I would assume, though, it happens all over the world. Cases get withdrawn from time to time. What makes South Africa unique? Or the NPA in particular?
We are not unique. In any jurisdiction, a prosecuting authority occupies a very unique space between the executive and the judiciary. So whilst the President has the power to appoint the NDPP, and the Constitution says acting as the head of the executive, and the prosecuting authority is part of the executive. But in the certification case of the final Constitution, the Constitutional Court said that by virtue of saying that the NPA must exercise its functions without fear, favour or prejudice, gives it a constitutional guarantee of independence at an operational level. So whilst on the one hand we have this institution that is located within the executive, it has to carry out its functions without in an independent fashion. And yet the other point is that the Constitution also provides that the Minister of Justice must exercise final responsibility over the NPA. And that's not really clarified or defined in any way within the NPA Act. So we're battling with this issue of the independence of the NPA on the one hand, as well as the political accountability of that institution through the Minister of Justice. And it's something that all jurisdictions grapple with.
Has accountability, would accountability necessarily mean interference? I think that everybody accounts to somebody else.
I think the best way that I understood it at the time when Advocate Visi Pikoli was in front of the Ginwala Commission, and there was a dispute between him and Advocate Menzi Simelane about that kind of power. And the best way that it was explained at that commission was the Minister and the DG of Justice exercises final accountability over the running of the organisation, which is really the budget, the money, the accountability, the money that goes to the NPA to fund its prosecutions, to fund its operations. But the NDPP is the one that finally decides about prosecutions. And even if you want to take it further, there's debate within the NPA itself over the role of the provincial directors of public prosecutions.
Hold that view. I want to take your views on whether the NPA has lost credibility. Send us your SMSs on 33726 or Facebook us on interface on SABC3. When we come back, I want to ask my guests, is political interference wrong necessarily? Welcome back. My guests this evening are City Press Assistant Editor Adrian Basson and Executive Secretary of CASAC, the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, Lawson Naidoo. Good evening and welcome back. My name is Rams Mabote. We're talking about the National Prosecuting Authority. We have some few SMSs here. Let me read actually Facebook comments for you. Nhlanhla Darlington Pankam is a very long name, it takes all the time, says, there's nothing wrong with where the power to appoint reside. It's the person that occupies the office currently. President Zuma abuses our laws, not because he's a power monger, but because he allowed himself to be corrupted. Faisal Tsweu says, no institution whose head is appointed by the president will ever be independent. And that's exactly what I wanted us to talk about, gentlemen. What is this thing called independence, Lawson? I don't understand it, actually.
Well, as we said earlier, you know, the president has the power to appoint this person, but it's not a normal political appointment. It is, and again, the Constitutional Court has made this very clear that it must be a non-partisan appointment of a very critical office within the criminal justice system. This person is one of the few public officials that has policy-making power. The NDPP has to determine prosecutorial policy with the concurrence of the minister. And that's where this relationship between the Minister of Justice and the NDPP comes together, in that they have to work together to define the prosecution policy. And the prosecutions that are undertaken in your name and in my name. So those prosecutions are undertaken in the public interest. So there's a very critical component of that relationship between the executive and the NDPP in terms of defining that prosecution policy.
Do we have any evidence of political interference? Because this independence matter speaks to also political interference. Has anybody ever produced direct and clear evidence of political evidence? Or is this assumed because we see cases being dropped or, you know, high flyers, you know, getting away with murder, so to speak?
Look, I mean, I think by direct evidence, you probably mean phone calls by ministers or presidents to the NDPP. No, we don't have that.
A letter here, an email there.
Yes, but I do think the NPA became very politicized through the Zuma matter, through the spy tapes matter. Because you remember the recordings were produced by the intelligence agency that the former head of the Scorpions and the former head of the NPA, Bulelani Ngcuka, were discussing the timing of the Zuma charges. Now, is that political interference or not? I would say that comes very close to interference into the independence, at least, of the National Prosecuting Authority. And what you need in that position is someone strong and independent-minded. Obviously, there's nothing as absolute independence. None of us are absolutely independent. But I and the public, I think, want to know that the person in that position is strong enough to withstand any kind of political interference. And unfortunately, these examples that you have highlighted in your slot earlier tonight may show, indicate, or create that perception that that is not the case currently.
But then the other cases of Cheryl Gwele, of Shabir Sheikh, of Jackie Selebi, they were successful prosecutions. Would the politicians have been happy then with them and they're not happy with the others? It doesn't come across to me that it would be right.
Some would argue that the only reason those people were prosecutors was because they weren't in political favor of the president of the day. Jackie Selebi, if you remember very well, was protected by the previous regime, by Thabo Mbeki, who suspended Vusi Pikoli, through the Jinwala Commission, who found that Vusi Pikoli was fit and proper for the job, but he was still fired. Shabir Sheikh, some will say, was a scapegoat for the Zuma case. So I do think, you know, we enter the realm of selective prosecutions. That's a very valid debate to have.
It's also a realm of perception. It's also a realm of supposition, because whatever you just said now, it's supposition. It's based on what you perceive.
But Ram's perception is truth. If you remember when Julius Malema was arrested a few weeks ago and brought before court, the question that everybody, or that a lot of people asked was, what is this timing about? Why now? Why almost less than a year after the Hawks started to investigate him? There are a number of cases that I've researched for tonight's show, which the Hawks and the NPA has failed to prosecute over the years. After a number of years, there's Dave King, Glenn Agliati, Andrew Phillips, the strip club boss, John Stratton. Julius Malema, within less than 12 months, he was investigated, charged, brought before court, and you're automatically going to have those reactions. Now, I don't think it's an unfair question then to ask if there's any political interference in the NPA, if the NPA was put under some kind of pressure to take action against individuals.
How do we then ring-fence it from political interference?
Well, in terms of the legislation, the minister has the authority to ask the NDPP for reports and for information. Now, if we go back to the Vusi Pikoli suspension and the Selebi case, the then Minister of Justice, Bridget Mabandla, sent a letter to Vusi Pikoli, not just asking him for a report, but asking him for all the evidence that he had on the Celebi matter and telling him that he was not to act further until she had reverted to him. And that was a letter that was drafted by Menzi Simelane that he admitted to drafting during the Jinwala inquiry. And there's an example of undue interference with the discretion of the NDPP to pursue a particular case. So that's obviously beyond the bounds of what is acceptable. Now, the minister has the right to ask for reports, and that's not just an information exercise. There must be an exchange of views between the minister and the NDPP. But at the end of the day, it is the NDPP that must take the decision. The minister may well be able to bring to the attention of the NDPP matters that he or she may not be aware of because of issues that cabinet may be aware of and so on. And it's the responsibility of the minister to make the prosecutor aware of that, so that when he or she takes the decision, they take a prosecutorial decision based on all the facts at their disposal, but ultimately it is their decision and no one else's.
But when they are appointed by the president, they have to give the president some benefit and speak back to them in confidence and give them stuff that may not be favorable to other people.
Indeed, and again, going back to the Vusi Pikoli case, Vusi Pikoli kept the president and the Minister of Justice very well briefed on the developments in the investigation.
But isn't that exactly the independence we're complaining about?
No, because they have a responsibility to inform the political authorities and the executive in particular about particularly sensitive cases. So, for example, cases such as prosecution of the head of the police service is a matter that has to be brought to the attention of the executive. It would be unconscionable for an NDPP to pursue a prosecution without making the executive aware of that.
Adrian, I'm still battling how we're going to ring-fence the NPA and indeed the NDPP from political interference.
Rams, I think the Constitutional Court's judgment and the SCA's judgment that came before that in the Menzi Simelane matter is a very good starting point. I think one must go back to those judgments and see what the court found is a proper fit and proper person to lead that organization. And I think the damage that's been done to the NPA through this whole process has been enormous. I think the chilling effect it had on prosecutors is problematic. So the President and the Justice Minister, Jeff Radebe, now has to sit and look at potential candidates. Obviously, they trust.
I want us to talk about candidates when we come back. 90% success rate is what I see in the annual report of the NPA. Is it maybe a case of PR, that they're not doing the right job in telling us about how they do well? When we come back, we talk about the NPA and its perceptions. Welcome back. My guests this evening are City Press Assistant Editor Adrian Basson and Executive Secretary at the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, Lawson Naidoo. 33726 is the SMS number, and these are some of your SMSs that just came now. The NPA is looking after powerful citizens considering the Constitution. That's Martin. Juju, somebody from Florida says, or is Florida the name, I'm not sure, says, NPA has become a political tool in the hands of the ANC and answers to its master's voice, ask Juju. That's Julius Malema. Nothing is just a justice controlled by individuals. That's Chris Mazibuko. And lastly, in South Africa, law favors those who are connected. That's anonymous, but I think that's what happens all over the world. The law favors those who are connected with the money and who are powerful.
I think that's unfortunately the sad reality, that if you're rich, like these names that I mentioned earlier, take someone like Dave King, who after 13 years of investigation, prosecution, millions of rands spent by the state of trying to prosecute him, and he's walking free. There is definitely a certain way a rich person is treated by the justice system, and a poor person who's arrested for stealing a loaf of bread and treated in a very different way by lower courts, probably kept in custody, not released on bail. But Rams, I just want to, if there's a perception that the entire NPA is about to fall apart, that's not true.
Well, I wanted us to deal with that because in the beginning when I mentioned the 90% success rate, you said to me, but those are smaller cases. Now, I worry because that's what they do every day. You can't just dismiss a 90% success rate because, Dave King King is not found guilty because,
Absolutely agree with you. And I think there are thousands of prosecutors all over the country in our magistrates' courts and district courts that does a sterling job and that prosecutes people day after day. What I'm concerned about is the impact that these cases have on the perception of the independence of the NPA, of this type of prosecutors, the skills that are left at the top level when you talk about corruption prosecutions, and especially when politicians are involved.
I'll come to you, Lawson. Is it because people like Adrian who write out there and inform public perception are so hungry to see these prosecutions succeed that they therefore think when they fail, the NPA has failed? Because prosecutions sometimes fail objectively because they could not find evidence.
Well, we can just look at the facts, really. And if you take the Amigos case, for example, where this Mr. Gaston Savoy allegedly paid bribes to politicians in KwaZulu-Natal and the Northern Cape to obtain tenders from the health departments. Now, here's two politicians who were involved in the process.
Allegedly.
Allegedly who's been involved. Well, they were charged. And as the case was about to go to court, charges are withdrawn by someone who was just put into this position because the previous acting person didn't want to do it. If you listen to what's happening in the Northern Cape, where Mr. John Block, the leader of the ANC in that province, is also on trial, and there's already murmurings that the case against him will be dropped as well. And those are the things that the media must focus on.
Lawson, when I took a break, I said it's a perception matter. And I'm not dismissing what Adrian is saying. And as I sit here, I have to ask myself this question. Is the NPA suffering mostly because they're doing badly in managing their own image and saying to people, we actually are a bloody good organization. When we withdraw cases, maybe we should tell you why we withdraw cases. And when we make successes that may not be in the public space, we should tell you more about them.
A critical factor in looking at independence is public perceptions. And it is these cases, and particularly the politically connected cases, and it's not that cases that fail in court, it's when the case doesn't even get to court that irks ordinary citizens and causes low morale in the NPA, because prosecutors that have worked hard to prepare cases suddenly find that a senior prosecutor has changed, and then a week or so after that prosecutor has changed, a case is dropped. So it's those sorts of things that give the NPA a bad name. And the fact that we've had, for the last 2 years, poor leadership within the National Prosecuting Authority, and we have to accept that.
Let's talk about that leadership. We're sitting with an acting NDPP at the moment. What sort of person should become the National Director of Public Prosecution? Not who, but what kind of person?
Well, it's got to be a person who is fiercely independent, to be able to properly exercise the functions of that office, which is to prosecute without fear, favour or prejudice, to objectively look at the factors and to be able to say, on the basis of the evidence, that there is a reasonable chance of success with this case, and therefore we will take that case to court, regardless of who is involved, and if it conforms with the prosecution policy guidelines that have been agreed with the Minister of Justice. Once all of those things are done, then the prosecutorial decision has then got to be taken without a consideration of any other external factors.
And fierce independence would mean what? Prosecuting government leaders?
I think if one look at the example of Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who is the public protector, and what she has done with that office in her term, I think that's a good example of showing real fierce independence. Why is she held in such high regard by, I think, most South Africans? I think because she has shown that she's not scared of anyone. She's not scared of the police chief. She's not scared of opposition parties. And she's not scared of the president of the country. She investigated all of them and, in fact, found against all of them, if I'm correct. So I think that's the kind of person. It's someone who has the guts and the integrity and the dignity to say to inform the ministers and the president, this is who we're investigating, this is what we're doing, but you're not going to tell me how to do my job.
Betrays the whole thing, that we seem to be excited because they find high-profile people guilty. She pronounces against high-profile people, therefore she's doing a good job. But I don't think that should be the only criteria to make somebody good or bad.
Sure, I think it's really about the integrity to investigate those cases, and when you go to court, to do your best to prosecute it without fear or favour, and not to create any perceptions about special treatments, not to send in a junior prosecutor against a very senior counsel, those kind of things.
Should this move out of the hands of the president? Should somebody else appoint the MP?
Well, that's an option that's open. I mean, in the certification case in 1996, it was argued that the NDPP should have been appointed by the Judicial Services Commission. we may want to consider now that maybe the NDPP should be appointed by an ad hoc committee of Parliament that is representative of all political parties in Parliament. But ultimately, whichever structure or individual has the power to exercise the responsibility needs to take heed of what the Constitutional Court said now in the Simelane case and follow the guidance that the court has given in terms of what constitutes a fit and proper person for this particular position.
Lawson Naidu, Adrian Basson, unfortunately 30 minutes is never enough to do any justice to a subject like this, but thank you very much for joining us. Well, I don't know what you think. I just think that the National Prosecuting Authority could do much better in managing its public perceptions. But also, your views about the NPA do really matter, and I really have enjoyed listening to them and listening to my guests. That's it for tonight. Interface will be back again next week. Email us on interface@sabc3.co.za or catch us on Facebook. From me, Rems Mabode, and the team. Goodbye and good night.